Baptist is a person who believes a set of truths known as the Baptist distinctives. It's not as common as it used to be, but you could go to almost any religious designation and say a Nazarene is someone who believes the Nazarene distinctives, or Presbyterian believes Presbyterian distinctives. And that has been shaded and colored in our day and age where it's hard to tell what anything is.
Right. What are we standing up for? The ability, the freedom to do what's right as God defines that right.
God's the ultimate author of liberty.
We don't want government to stand between us and our freedom to do what is right.
Hi, I'm Doug Levesque. Welcome to the Bible Nation podcast. Today we're going to be talking about Baptist impact. What impact are Baptists making in the world today? What are our problems? We're here in studio with Dr. Phil Stringer and Pastor Jason Georges. Good to have you gentlemen in here today. Are you ready to talk about Baptists?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Dr. Phil Stringer has written a book, The Faithful Baptist Witness, regenerated church membership, bunch of different issues on this, and we'll be talking about this book a little bit later. He's been here with us this weekend talking about Baptist heritage, and we thought this would make for a great podcast orientation. So how did services go, Pastor George?
We had a wonderful Sunday yesterday, and we like to do that every couple of years. And
did we have any non-Baptist detractors here?
Well, because we are a church that believes in multiplying worship, and we're constantly evangelizing, there's always new people that need to hear of these old truths.
Okay, yeah, that's good. I like that. All right. I like that. Brother Stringer, how is the book doing? Is it still selling well? You do get invited. You've been on other podcasts about Baptist Faithful Witness.
Yes, I have. The book is still very, very active. It's been interesting. It was the first thing I ever wrote. It is easily the thing I'm best known for, even though I've been involved with a number of other things. It is the thing that I'm best known for. It's in a number of different languages. There's an Arabic edition. There's a Burmese edition. There's a Spanish edition, a Russian edition, a French edition. And I come across it and people familiar with it in all kinds of settings that I had not expected. And so, yes. It's
Praise the Lord.
there.
I know you've spoken in a lot of different Christian college venues where you would be expected to come speak on Baptist heritage. But have you had any contact with secular colleges or broader universities that were interested in the topic?
Not about this topic.
Okay. Yeah, and why would they?
Yeah.
Right? Why they need to know.
No, it's a great book. If people don't have it, The Faithful Baptist Witness, I know we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but it has been a huge help to me in understanding these different topics. And
let me say this one thing about it. The complaint that I get about the book.
Right.
It's not a complaint that bothers me, but it's not a textbook. It's not written to be a textbook, and it's not written in textbook style.
Right.
Used to be common, historical books would either be textbook style or they would be what was called popular history or brief history. And I wrote it popular history on purpose. There are already a number of great Baptist history books written textbook style. They're 500 pages.
Right.
Or they cost $100 to purchase one. But I've got a number of them. They're worth $100. They're worth the time it takes to read the 500 pages. But I just had the idea that most of our people weren't buying them and reading them. So this was written for the average person sitting in the pew. It's about 200 pages. It is a conversational style rather than a textbook style. That's on purpose. That's why when I get that criticism, I'm not upset by it. I tell folks, if you only knew how hard I worked to get it to be that way.
Right.
But because we almost never write history that way anymore.
Right.
And in our circles, we never write history that way.
Right.
Folks weren't expecting that, and they weren't used to it. So I'll tell you right front, it's not written to be a textbook style. It's not full of footnotes and maps and these type of things. It's simply designed to tell the story step by step. We wrote it that way on purpose. It has been very popular, and we're grateful for that. I think it has been popular precisely because it has been written that style, and we did it that way on purpose. But if you're looking for another textbook style Baptist history, this isn't it.
Right.
And just like the messages I brought at church yesterday, or when I'm doing a Baptist history conference, and this was my third Baptist history conference the last 8 days.
Yeah.
It's been interesting. I had one in Indianapolis, had one on out in Oklahoma and then here in Michigan. But it is, you can get lost in the details of the history sometimes in history lectures. They're not history lectures like you would expect to find in college.
Right.
I do that too.
Right.
But they're not history lectures like you would expect to find in college. They're aimed at the person sitting on the back pew who's never been here before, but that can be given something they can understand.
Something that's the scope and sequence can be grasped in a service or two. And, and you've done a great job at that. So.
Yeah, don't let the simple style fool you.
Right.
It's full of substance, but in the presentation and how it's presented, it reads like a story. You find yourself in the narrative. It's not necessarily a technical history.
So we're all Baptist preachers in here. Let's talk about what is a historic Baptist. How do you define that? How does it stand out from in Christianity? What is historic Baptist?
Yeah. A Baptist is a person who believes a set of truths known as the Baptist distinctives. It's not as common as it used to be, but you could go to almost any religious designation and say a Nazarene is someone who believes in Nazarene distinctives, or Presbyterian believes Presbyterian distinctives. And that has been shaded and colored in our day and age where it's hard to tell what anything. But historically, a Baptist is a person who believes a set of doctrines referred to as a Baptist distinctives. Some people will list it as 6 or 7 or 8 because some of them divide them up, but 6 basic truths. Baptist, somebody believes the Bible is the sole authority for faith and practice. That believes in independent autonomous churches. Believes in a regenerated church membership. That believes in the priesthood of all believers. We don't have priests, we are priests. And believes in 2 ordinances, no sacraments, but 2 ordinances. Baptism by immersion of believers only, and the Lord's Supper. And it believes in the separation of church and state and religious liberty. And so throughout the ages, there were a lot of people that believed those things who were not called Baptist. The name began to be commonly used in the 1500s and has stuck, and in the age of printing and mass communication, it is the name. But before the 1500s, there were a lot of different names for people who believed these things. But the denominator was not the name or an organization. It was these doctrines. Baptist. And there, of course, folks who still use the name Baptist that don't believe any of those doctrines. But a real Baptist is someone who believes the Baptist distinctives. So
today we've got, everybody's naming their church just such and such fellowship and the Rock and the River. And there is this kind of muddied waters and between Protestants, Baptists, evangelicals, and in some cases Pentecostal type groups. And so do those groups believe those distinctives, or do they not believe those distinctives? Let's talk about that.
Well, we're in the era of what I call the undefined church. And we're going to have a church, the less said about what it believes and teaches, the better, because they're consciously trying not to be defined. Or as I put it, when they pass the offering plate, they want Pentecostal money in it, they want Catholic money in it, they want Nazarene money in it, they want Presbyterian money in it, and they want Baptist money in it. And that is the booming church of our moment. It's the fad of our moment. I don't think it's anything more than a fad, but it is the fad of our moment, the undefined church. So they believe as little as possible because they want to expand the audience from which they can gather money as widely as possible.
We in the past, I've done classes on the emergent church, and I've said it's kind of coming out of all these churches being muddied, because then what comes out of it is a pseudo church and maybe even a dangerous church, a church that is like what John saw in Revelation, the woman that rides the beast. He was amazed. He thought he was looking at a bride, but it was really a whore. This undefined church concept, and some Baptist churches do call themselves Baptist, but they're not really defining themselves as Baptist. And so I think that undefining movement is dangerous, and I think some Baptists kind of slide out of Baptist by, de-defining themselves. And so maybe one of the things we add to that definition is that the Baptist church, true Baptist church, is not afraid to be defined as such.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I know it sounds harsh to say that this is a fundraising technique, but honestly, at the essence of it, I really believe it is.
Yeah, and it's a fundraising technique under the guise of trying to reach the unreachable, or what they would call the unchurched. But usually what these churches are full of, they're not full of the unchurched, they are full of the disgruntled.
Absolutely. I have never seen an undefined church that was really, really successful in reaching lost people.
Right.
They build their membership on getting folks out of the Baptist church and out of the Presbyterian church, out of Pentecost. They're reaching churched people.
Yeah.
And they play on the bad fads of the moment, which come up among Pentecostals and Presbyterians, and I'm sorry to say among Baptists as well. And they kind of exploit those bad moments. And it really is. It is a great way to raise money if that's your ultimate goal.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about then, how has that defined church, that distinction Baptist, how has that affected America in the past? To what debt do we owe Baptists in American history?
Baptists were more influential than anybody. They were not the only ones. There are others that deserve credit as well. But Baptists were more influential than anyone in creating a nation with belief in limited government, religious liberty, separation of church and state. Baptists played a unique role, and they were the ones who taught it. And I know you listen to both of you over the years. You talk a lot about taking Christian thought to the mainstream civilization. It was the Baptists that took that thought to the mainstream.
It's a very Baptist thing of us to do.
Yes, it was. Yes, it is. And it was Baptists that took it, and people like Patrick Henry and others picked it up, and we owe them a debt. But it was Baptists who were teaching that when they were kind of very lonely in the teaching of religious liberty. The Quakers were the other example, and teaching religious liberty and suffering and being persecuted. But over a 60-year period, they go from being a persecuted, laughed-at minority to having impacted the mainstream and the majority of the population.
Yeah.
That's an incredible, incredible accomplishment, and one that ought to be looked at and given credit to a lot more than it is.
It's fascinating to put together those two thoughts that conservative thought of limited government, but then linking it or putting it right beside the idea of religious liberty, because this concept of limited government really is the result or the pivot away, the response to governments that had taken too much control over people's religious lives. And so even our American conservative principle of limited government is not about, and it's not an economic principle first, our fiscal conservativeness. It's a religious liberty principle.
Absolutely.
I just republished a book in another label that I'm republishing books, and it was about Baptists in the American Revolution. And in that, historians pointed out that different states had different denominational character, and even they taxed the populace in order to feed those particular denominations.
Right.
And Baptists never would kind of register. Baptists never really would pay taxes to the state in that regard, even though they were taxed. And so they really had this idea of no taxation without representation. And by the way, we don't want representation from the state. Just leave us alone and we'll do our own thing. And so this concept of no taxation without representation was kind of heralded in defense by Baptists in every state against denominational rule in those particular states. And that kind of bleeded out in the Revolution to every other denomination and every other American, that we don't want taxation without representation. But that was a concept that they had started because they didn't want to. A lot of them would lose their church properties because of the taxation. And so, this idea of no taxation without representation, we now know this as something that we were saying to the King of England, but this was something that Baptists were saying to state entities prior to that. And so that was one thing that we can credit Baptists with having.
And just example of that, famous colony of Boonesboro in Kentucky. Where you find the first Baptist church in Kentucky. Squire Boone, Daniel's brother, was a Baptist preacher. And the Boones led a group of people to start this settlement. This doesn't get discussed much, but they were basically tax protesters. They did not want to pay taxes to the colonial government of North Carolina. And one of the reasons they didn't want to pay them is because the tax money would be used to finance state church.
Right.
And some were from Virginia, some from North Carolina, but they did not want to be taxed to pay for these state churches. They go out into Kentucky, which no Indian tribes lived in, but both tribes from the south and the north hunted in and met and warred in. They called it the Dark and Bloody Ground, but none of them lived there. And so they went to Kentucky, braving the wilderness, braving the challenges of the Indian tribes, because they wanted to start a settlement where religious liberty would not be at risk and where taxation for religious purposes wouldn't take place.
Right.
And that's why virtually all the original inhabitants of Boonesboro were Baptist. It was basically a Baptist tax protest.
Yeah, and, and here in the Rust Belt, we're still, so then you have later on, 100 years, 20 years later, the migration for employment of these Kentuckians to Michigan
Yes.
to work for the automotive companies. And so our Baptist churches here in Michigan have some heritage or linkage to that.
But by the way, you know what a Hoosier is? Citizen of
Yeah.
Indiana?
Uh-huh.
Hoosier's a Kentuckian whose car broke down before they got to Detroit.
They didn't quite make it here.
Yeah, that's not completely an exaggeration.
No.
My mother and father were both from Kentucky. They were both part of the migration, and their families originally intended to get to Detroit and ended up in Indianapolis. And because they just didn't make it that far,
the
it
gas
was too
ran
demanding,
out.
right?
Yeah, that's funny.
So
Well-
they would tell that story, that's what a Hoosier is, a Kentuckian whose car broke down before they got to Michigan.
Well, and so all this is this historic distinctive of the separation of church and state. And so we understand it in this historical application, but these distinctives are timeless because they're biblical. And so now they have their modern application, particularly what we've seen in the last couple of years in the church's response to COVID. The government's wanting to kind of dictate how churches would operate and function by way of assembly. But I know even more particular than that, part of that control was on the back of government subsidy, and I was surprised the number of Baptist churches today who had kind of lost their way of this distinctive of like, we don't want any, don't hurt us, but don't help us. Just leave us alone. And that is the true concept of religious liberty there. And yet we're willing, now there's a generation of Baptists that have kind of forgotten these distinctives from whence they come and are joining the line to putting their hand out for government assistance.
And you're absolutely right. And the other side of it is that civil government has forgotten what all that was about. And I was preaching out in Rhode Island during the beginnings of the pandemic, and the state had issued a guideline in which it was saying, you need to worship remotely. And it begins by saying they'd consulted with worship experts. And worship experts agree you do not have to be present physically in order to worship.
Right.
Well, thank you for that direction
Yes.
from the state.
Right.
Which means so much.
Worship experts.
And when I was in Florida, we fought a 5-year battle with the state of Florida over the attempt to regulate Bible colleges, which we eventually won, and the law got changed. And it was fascinating to me because we had meeting after meeting after meeting, and I'm trying to make this case, and I'm dealing with the bureaucrats, and there's a government agency that's supposed to regulate independent colleges and all that. When it's all over and we've won, and about a year later I'm moving to Chicago, I was asked if I would come to another meeting. And I was a little surprised, and so I went and came, and they said, "We want to thank you." They said, "We know you think we were opposed to religious liberty, but said honestly, we didn't know anything about the concept. We'd never heard about it before until you forced us to pay attention to it. It wasn't anything we knew anything about."
Yeah.
And I got to thinking afterwards. I said, "They're sincere about this."
Yeah.
And again, where would they have learned it from?
Yeah.
At their secular
Yeah.
colleges they attended? Would they have told them about it? They probably didn't hear it in the churches they attended. And so to them, it's, what are they talking about religiously?
Yeah.
There was no such concept.
Yeah.
So you're right, the churches have forgotten, civil government's forgotten. And might be a good time to start reminding
and we're
everybody.
reaping the fruits of this
Oh, we
ignorance
are.
because now with the gender issues that are happening on and LGBTQ issues that are happening, that there's not even an awareness that religious liberty is being trampled upon because we're not aware of these principles.
That's right. Nor is there an awareness that should be considered.
Right.
And I know we're fighting the same battle in Illinois about Bible colleges right now. And it wasn't last fall, it was the fall before. We've been before the education committees in the legislature. We've written similar legislation to Florida, and we passed the state Senate 4 times. And it's never come up for a vote in the State House of Representatives. They won't allow it to come up for a vote. But we were at the Education Committee, Senate Education Committee, not last fall, fall before. And the State Department of Education always sends someone to speak against our bill. And the person that was speaking against it finally hit the core of what they're really all about. They said, look, if we don't have the power to regulate Bible colleges in the state of Illinois, Bible colleges might not accept homosexual students. They said, we cannot have that in the state of Illinois.
So
That was the real issue.
my next question was, is modernity putting pressure on Baptists? If so,
Oh,
how?
I guess.
And I think the screaming answer is LGBTQ. And I always felt like, even though we lost the abortion fight in '73, and we supposedly are still fighting it and maybe winning it in certain states, the idea is that the unborn child was losing their religious liberty, but nobody else was. But now when we have this LGBTQ issue, those two things can't hold the same space. There
they
can't
can't.
be LGBTQ civil rights and religious liberty at the same time. And so we've come to this point where it's one or the other on that ground, and it's kind of a 50-50 battle right now. It doesn't seem like we're winning. So what should Baptists do to persevere through modernity's attacks? What's
Let
the
me
answer?
say three things real quick. Number one, we've got to go back to teaching these issues. Okay, we've got to teach them in our churches, and it's got to have to be. And I said this once 7 years ago, isn't going to work. We're going to have to go through and teach this in more detailed fashion in our independent Baptist churches. Many of our independent Baptist people do not know what a Baptist is. We're going to have to become teaching churches beyond what we have been in recent years.
Right.
Just have to be. That's one thing. Secondly, we need to take this concept into the mainstream, and it's not an easy thing to do because we don't have access to schools, etc. But we have to bring this up when the moment comes. We have to address it. We have to talk about it, and we're going to have to be willing to accept the fact that we will be looked down upon and thought as a bunch of dummies. Whoever heard of this kind of before thing? But Baptists went through this for 60 years. Went from you just a handful of exceptional idiots to the mainstream of civilization.
Right.
We need to start that process all over again.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we're at the beginning again, and we have to take this process all over again. And I think that includes forming organizations for the purpose of promoting religious liberty. And that's on my mind because I'll be meeting with somebody who asked me to put a plan together for that next week.
Good.
But third thing, we have to be willing to stand our ground and fight. It's been my experience a vast majority of the time, the state will back down before you do. Okay, they're trying to intimidate you.
Right.
Now, when I said vast majority, I said vast majority. I did not say always.
Right.
In other words, don't call me if you end up in jail.
Well, do call me, and I'll do what I can to help, but I'm not guaranteeing you that you won't.
Right.
Yeah.
I have seen the state back down so many times, and I will tell you, involved in religious liberty disputes, I've been threatened. Where you'll be arrested, you'll be sued, you'll be this. I can't even count the number of times I've been threatened over the last, say, 30 years without them ever doing anything.
Right.
The threat is not always reality. But having said that, it's people say, I'm going to call their bluff. They're bluffing the vast majority of the time. They are not always bluffing.
Right.
And you have to be prepared, and you have to be willing to pay the price.
Right.
And there may be such a price to be paid. When we were going into the battle in Florida, the pastor I was working for, he said, I want to know one thing before we start this battle. He said, are you willing to go to jail over it? He said, there's a reasonable chance you and I both will be.
Yeah.
He says, are you willing to go to jail over it?
Yeah.
I said, I don't want to, but yes,
That was
I have to.
I think 1986, 87, there was a huge fight in the state of Michigan over private schools having quote unquote state certified teachers, which included gender and diversity training and among other things. And the majority of the Christian schools, of every stripe, said no, we're not going to do this. And it was the largest physical bodied protest in Lansing at the Capitol building ever, before or since, as far as bodies on the lawn, there. And ultimately, we lost the fight. Ultimately, they voted that teacher certification was going to be the law of the land, which would have put most of our schools under. And the Michigan Association of Christian Schools at the time, and the director said, well, I hope you're ready to arrest all of us. And everybody was willing to just say, you're going to have to come and chain this and arrest parents. And I don't know how much that was spit and vinegar. I don't know how much of that was real or not. But the fact of the matter is the governor called, like the next day and said, don't worry, you guys all just kind of function. So we've kind of functioned under this understanding in these parentheses and under this clause that, yeah, we passed this, but you guys go ahead. And for 30, 40 years now, we've been, functioning just under that understanding. I wouldn't even call it the law. And none of us are in total compliance with that law.
And they really don't want the image of being seen out, the politicians don't want the image of being seen out arresting all these Christians for practicing their Christianity, no matter what they say. And I will tell you, we're in the exact same situation in Illinois. Virtually everything that is done in the realm of Christian education in Illinois is technically illegal, even though they're not, at this moment, taking steps to enforce it. And in fact, I was told that they actually passed a law giving them authority over Bible colleges in 1941 and have not enforced it.
Yeah.
You haven't had time to get around to it yet. But, well, that's normally how it works in this country. There is no guarantee. And I have seen some situations where people really had to stand and be prepared to suffer loss. Back in 1981, when they were trying to close down a Christian school in Nebraska, somewhat similar. They said you could have Christian school, but the teachers all have to be a member of the teachers union. And to be a member of a teachers union, you had to have all the stuff that you were talking about. And a Christian school refused, only had 7 families in it. They arrested the pastor and 7 fathers, which was a very gender discriminatory thing. They arrested the 7 fathers and put them in jail. Little town with a sheriff and a deputy. We called them Andy and Barney. But and then they said the church, in order to make sure the school didn't continue, they said the church can only be open 2 hours Sunday morning, an hour and a half Sunday night, and an hour on Wednesday.
Right.
And they padlocked the doors. And on Sunday morning, there were about 60 preachers that had shown up, and they refused to leave at the end of the 2 hours, and they called the state police. The state police came out, threw them out in the yard, padlocked the door. Well, by Wednesday, there were 1,200 preachers there. Church auditorium couldn't have held 200 at max. And we were waiting for them to unlock the church on Wednesday night for the hour, and then nobody was going to leave. And I was there with 2 friends. We were early. We wanted to get in, get a seat, but the crowd kept coming in and coming in. We got pushed out the other end of the church building, so we're actually on the outside edge. We were right where the sheriff was, and we could hear him calling for the state police. And they must have asked him how many of them there were. He said 1,000, which was actually a low estimate.
It was probably way more than they had state police.
Yeah, and they must have told him no because nobody came.
Right.
So they're not coming for 1,000 preachers.
Right.
And eventually the state changed the law to make the thing go away. There's a lot more to that story, but you get the idea. When people stood up, at some point the state says, well, this is more than we wanted to fool with.
Right.
I don't know if you could get 1,200 preachers today.
But what happens, and this has been our opinion, whenever there's a religious liberty issue that comes up in our state, there is always a push to have an exemption clause for churches or some sort of religious liberty exemption. And it's frustrating to me, and it's frustrating to us, how many pastors and churches clamor for that exemption, because what that done is it defers the fight to someone that's less suitable and less equipped to be able to fight the fight. Now you got the elderly baker and the florist that's fighting a religious liberty fight, not the pulpit. But, as you were saying that story, it also, it kind of put this perspective on my mind. It's also convenient for the state because they don't want that seen. So let's give them an exemption so we don't have to go lock up a bunch of preachers. It's easier because there is the potential for that type of rally point, a padlock church. I think America is getting close to being willing to accept it, but not yet, to see a padlock church, to see those kind of things that would go on the mainstream. Now, we've seen padlock churches before, but that would take on that mainstream kind of identity or caricature. And so that's why we got to be against exemptions. We don't need to have a clause that is special just for our operation.
It's the state that needs to change.
Yes.
Not the church.
Well, and to give an exemption is to say the state has arbitration over this, except for this clause, and we're not willing to do that. Okay, let's turn the tables on ourselves now. Let's look in the mirror at ourselves. We know the state, the winds are blowing in the wrong direction, but let's look at ourselves, because why can't we get 1,200 pastors together? can we overcome our own flaws? What are our own flaws that we need to be addressing amongst ourselves as true defined Baptists?
If you ask the question, what's the greatest strength of the Independent Baptist movement? And if you ask the question, what is the biggest weakness of the Independent Baptist movement? The answer is identical.
Mm-hmm.
We're independent.
Right.
And that's what gives us our strength.
Mm-hmm.
We are not just following some whim or fad or orders from central headquarters. However, sometimes it means we're not willing to put our disagreements aside and rally around something essential when we absolutely need to. And we need to be refocused on that. And I've got to work with you two gentlemen for years. And it's one of the things we've talked about many times. You know, our test of fellowship on every issue needs to be different.
Right.
For example, I have worked with Amish on religious liberty issues. I've worked with Seventh-day Adventists on religious liberty issues. Now, I can absolutely promise you no Seventh-day Adventist is going to teach a class at Day Spring Bible College.
Right,
It's
right.
not going to happen.
Right.
But on that religious liberty issue was a different discussion.
Right.
And our Independent Baptist movement has sometimes been in danger of being so fragmented we can never come back together
Right.
because you know, you guys have beards
Yeah.
and I don't,
Yeah.
and that's real. In fact, I should leave right now
Right.
because you guys have beards.
Right.
And it might be that God will have to send us something very drastic
Right.
to get us to see past that.
Yeah.
And if our people haven't seen that we're in a problem right now, man, we're missing something. You know, because the level of the problem is pretty obvious. We have got to go back to being teaching churches, and we have got to be willing to address individual situations as they stand. I have fought for the Amish to be able to have their own schools, even though I wouldn't put a kid in an Amish school for anything.
Right.
You know, but the question was, whose children are these?
Right.
You know,
Would you say, like, in our movement, though, as historic Baptists or independent Baptists, that the reason we struggle with proper independence, in other words, we're autonomous, but then we rally around the same thing, is because we have redefined ourselves, at least in a cultural sense, from being defined by principles and now rallying around personalities.
That's part of it. Is it personalities rather than principles? Sometimes it's the success model. The purpose of our church is to be successful. It's to be smooth. It's to be able to convince people this is an easy place to go to church, etc.
Right.
And we don't want to fight these battles.
That's good.
And we've even, you know, we have our church growth things. We'll say, if you just do this and this and this,
Yeah.
everything will be smooth and wonderful and great, and power of positive thinking. And if you're doing right, everything at church will be smooth. You never fight a battle. That isn't the ultimate.
Right.
It's nice when it happens.
Right.
I belong to a large, very smoothly run, well-organized church that has a great relationship with the local community. That is just absolutely wonderful when you can have it. But that is not our ultimate challenge as a church.
Right.
We've got to be willing to say these are the principles that we will stand for no matter what happens. Again, I'll go back to the thing in Florida. They had just passed a law giving the state power over Bible colleges and said, this is all the paperwork you have to fill out to ask for our permission. You know, and they found a little Bible college with 12 students that wouldn't do it. And so they sent them a cease and desist order. You must close down. So I went down and volunteered our help to them. Because I knew what they were doing. They wanted to close down the little school and set a legal precedent first. Guy was kind of surprised. And first he said, I don't want anybody's help. I said, well, you're going to get it whether you like it or not. Today we're great friends. But at first he was suspicious of it. But and then I wrote the State Department of Education a letter. I said, you understand this. You have sent him a cease and desist letter. He's not going to cease and desist. So what are you going to do? They called. We talked on the phone. I said, you sent him the letter. They said, he's not going to shut down. They said, well, he has to. We sent him a letter.
Right.
I said, you don't know much about Baptist history.
Right.
Our people have been burned at the stake, fed to wild animals, drowned, beheaded, we don't necessarily jump because we got a letter.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I said, by the way, I said, if you decide to arrest him, you have to ask, are we going to send the state police or the county police? And what's their jurisdiction for arresting pastors and Bible college leaders? And I said, if you do arrest him, I said, their college board's already voted, and I'm going to be the new president of their college, and I'm going to go down and run it.
Right.
Then you could, of course, come and arrest me. But we have a third person.
Right.
I said, we're already 7 deep.
Right.
And I promise you, by the time you put 2 or 3 of us in jail, there'll be more than that. And I tell that story, and people think you're out fighting those terrible liberal Democrats. It was the Jeb Bush administration.
Yeah.
And so then I said, and it was an election year. He was running for election. I said, Governor Bush might want to ask how many religious right preachers he wants to put in jail during a re-election year.
Mm-hmm.
And we never heard from them again.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So just doing what we're supposed to be doing with our face forward, not taking no for an answer, and when we're given a piece of paper, just continuing and standing strong. This is part of Baptist heritage.
Yeah.
It is our heritage.
And it is Baptist impact. Guys, we've come to the end of our first session. I think we're going to take this into another session. But folks, I want you to stick around and watch part 2 of Baptist Impact. Remember, the best culture is a Bible culture. It's proven and it works. Check us out on BibleNation.org.